First 5 years of the BRI was pretty straightforward. It was announced in 2013 by Xi Jinping in two speeches. It was integrated, if you wish, into not only the constitution, but into almost every aspect of Chinese foreign policy, the economy. Over 11 action plans were released by early 2018, describing different elements of the Belt Road Initiative. And the main financing agencies were all policy banks run by the Chinese government, though the AIIB, of which India is the #2 partner, was also brought into the picture. It represents a small fraction of the total investment to the BRI that China has done. According to most analysts, it's about $500 billion has been spent or contracted for. In other words, this is money that the government has agreed to give, but actually is not officially handed over. By 2017, we saw the Belt Road Initiative's remit spread from its original Eurasian center to Africa, Latin America, Oceania, and now the Arctic. Some of the other elements, we all know about the 6 corridors of the Maritime Silk Route. Some of those corridors, like the BCIM, is not particularly going anywhere, and even some of the ones in the Caucasus, for example, are not particularly active. But I think I'll point out some of the other elements that are important. The 5 connectivities, in other words, the policy that you listed here: policy coordination, infrastructure building, unimpeded trade, financial integration, people-to-people exchanges. All key elements, because in many ways this is the soft stuff, the webbing that connects all of the physical infrastructure together and sets standards. It's important to realize they always talk about this community of common destiny, or sometimes shared future, depending on how you translate it, because in many ways that is the alternative world view, the world order they wish to put, and that's often integrated or combined with comments on the Belt Road Initiative. It's integrated into the 5-year plan. It's part of the Made in China 2025 plan. It lays out technological priorities for both the spread of those technologies by China, but also the development of market share for Chinese products in those areas: aviation, aerospace, electrical power, next generation IT, rail transport, and marine technology. And there are a whole host of other subsidiary technologies which are listed as well. And then finally, there's a digital future, international strategy and cooperation in cyberspace as a key element of the BRI, and includes a lot of standard setting and market share control that they're moving on to. So the original BRI, well, they showed the original heart of the BRI was, as we all know, infrastructure. 65% of BRI investments between 2013 and 2018 were in transport and energy. Half of them were in Asia, and half of the ones in Asia were in Southeast Asia. 40% of the investments in Asia were largely in the energy sector. Pakistan, as you know, is one of the major beneficiaries. It's important to realize this is not FDI, this is a combination of direct loans, FDI, portfolio, so ODA put together. Africa was at #2, about a quarter of the total BRI investments went there, overwhelmingly in the transport sector and initially connected to the extraction of resources. West Asia, a distant third, and largely built around the question of rejigging the entire energy supply routes of China so they would not be dependent on or be less concerned about US naval power. Very quickly then, this is a report by Natixis, the French financial corporation, about looking at just as the FDI. Now I want to point this out. The FDI in many ways is the most commercially driven segment of BRI financing, as opposed to the ODA and other issues. Sorry. This tends to go into places where they think they will make money. Singapore has gotten a lot of this, largely because it's just commercially makes sense to do so. But you'll see a lot of concentration in Southeast Asia and a little bit in Central Asia and a bit in. But otherwise, a lot of the riskier parts of the planet, you don't see FDI going into. What has BRI done, at least in its first phase? Very useful. The biggest game has been on the trade integration side. You can look at the number of intermediate goods. So I use intermediate goods as an example of the degree of integration, of supply chain integration that we see. And you can see that if you are a BRI country, you've been getting your biggest trade movement has actually been in the question of integration. Final goods haven't been all that high, but integration, Intermediate goods, supply chain valuation, BRI is brought you into the Chinese supply chain. And I'll just say there's an independent study that I don't mention here, but just looking at Europe's supply chains now, European supply chains are actually more integrated now with China than they are within Europe. That's the kind of degree of integration we've been able to, that partly come through. I'll just quickly mention here Africa, which tends to get neglected in a lot of BRI studies. This is a map, this is a diagram showing the degree of project activity under BRI, which is basically all of the projects China does are now declared BRI. And you can see East Africa, the second pillar there, the big blue, dark blue pillar, that's East Africa, not only because of East Africa as a relatively well-developed part of Africa, but also it's on the Indian Ocean littoral. And this is a huge, the biggest concentration, because strategically that's the most important part of Africa, I would argue, for China. Southern Africa is also important, but South Africa is a relatively advanced economy and leads less of it. Just a quick one on Africa again, the number 2, the second largest circle, these are just total infrastructure construction projects in Africa by funding source. That number 2 circle is China. It's now the number 2 source of projects, financing of those type of projects in the entire continent of Africa, and literally dwarfs almost everything except African governments themselves. The second forum, which took place last year, the second BRI forum, we see Xi Jinping, partly because of the enormous pushback that we start to see across the world, partly led by countries, I would argue India led the way in many ways on the BRI. But the general, so she lays out a number of at least principles, which I won't go into details, but basically what you would expect, that we will be now more sensitive to local demands, we will try to do small-scale projects, and basically sugarcoats BRI to say it's going to be much more like a general ODA project, an Overseas Development Assistance project, rather than just the business of building roads and rail and ports that we did before. Calls upon Chinese firms to be BRI ambassadors when they go overseas. And I'll just mention one final point. He declares we need to get better propaganda on the BRI out there, that we're getting too much negative publicity. And that becomes a key element of the next phase, and we are right now in the next phase of the BRI. So where is the BRI going? It's already, elements of that already existed, but I would argue now we are going to be seeing, probably over the next 3 to 4 years, an increasing emphasis on digital, space, cyber, the space information corridor, the digital Silk Road, small things like fiber optic cable laying, e-commerce, digital payments, all of this is now being rolled out along with and often incorporated into BRI contracts. I know of at least 3 African countries which have already signed away the entire face recognition of their rights of their entire population as part of their BRI contracts. So the nation of Ethiopia, to get their BRI money, had to say that a Shanghai company had the right to everybody's facial recognition profile. All Ethiopian data is now stored in Shanghai. A number of other countries are now signing up for this remarkable demand, and a lot of them seem to accept this in return for what they're getting. Space Information Corridor, which is related to the Beidou satellite navigation system, which the Chinese hope will eventually replace the GPS system globally. And one of the signs of where we're going with the next stage of BRI is how construction is declining in importance. These are Chinese engineering projects overseas. This is from Gavikal data macro bond analysis. And you can see that the light blue line is the value of new contracts declining quite rapidly. They're simply not, they're there, but they're not as important as they were before. This is the digital Silk Road. It's a map you can't really see here, but this is on MERICS, the German Chinese think tank website. And that gives you a more detailed look at the number of various projects, including the optic fiber layout and so on that they're building across the world as part of the sort of new focus of the BRI. Another new element of the BRI that's developing is the security side. And this is based on the NVR study by Duchatel. And he argues effectively you're seeing the military side of BRI, partly because of course, CPEC itself, which has been under attack. Chinese now, he argues, effectively have three models of securitizing the Belt BRI. One is a Djibouti model, which is a straightforward open naval base or military base, which is quite public, gets a lot of trumpeting and both at home and abroad, tends to attract the most attention. I'm a media man, we always focus on this stuff. More quietly is the Mekong model, which is being used partly in Southeast Asia, where you see Chinese troops or armed militia joining local forces to do joint patrolling and coordination. We're now seeing this, of course, in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, where in the Wakhan border in particular, we're seeing Chinese presence, Wakhan border with both Afghan and Chinese troops working together, and their new military presence their old military but expanded military presence in Tajikistan, and I think it's called the QCCM agreement that they have between these two countries and China. And this is very clearly modeled on what they did in the Mekong. And then finally, a Syrian model, which is very focused on Islamicist terror, direct, indirect threats, Uyghurs, and so on. And in Syria, where they worked quietly with local players, they don't put any troops on the ground. They look at intelligence gathering. They look at targeted killing. And they've worked with both the Turks, the Russians, and the Syrians, and anybody in an attempt to go after the Uyghur groups that they believe are a threat to themselves. We're waiting to see, but my guess is that over time we're going to see these models expanded across other parts of the world when they see there's a problem or they see just an opportunity coming in. Hearts and Mind campaign. This is again, the Natixis did a survey of the media in over 130 countries around the world, and what did they say about the BRI? And broadly speaking, basically on the red is negative, on the green is positive. And you can see broadly, actually, most countries, there's a handful of countries. Our friends, the Maldivians, have become, thanks partly to India, highly sensitized against the BRI. But on the other hand, the Afghans are, among South Asians, the most pro-BRI country at the public level. Europeans are arguably the most diverse in terms of their opinions, with Poland on one end extremely negative, the Netherlands and smaller countries like Netherlands and Portugal on the other. Africa is also very diverse opinion, but generally positive about this, as are the Central Asians. But this is something that the Chinese are now targeting very importantly. And a number of magazines I now get from the Chinese alone touting the benefits of the BRI, and even between India and China. I think every week every 6 months or something, there's a new magazine or publication being produced, but they're deliberately going around the world and trying to switch this clearly to the green side. So why did the BRI, I'll go a little bit into the macroeconomy. Why was BRI even possible in the past? And ultimately, I would argue, is one of, obviously, GDP has grown. But the real thing is that they've just had a huge amount of money because the financial system of China has grown way beyond, at a much faster pace than the GDP. If you look at that for those figures, GDP grew from 1.2 trillion to 12.8 trillion between 2000 and 2010. That itself is brilliant, but the financial system grew in assets from 1.7 trillion, which is not too far away from the GDP figure, to $38 trillion in that same time. Assets of China's banking system today are equal to 50% of the world's annual output, which is much larger than their share of GDP. Or to put it another way, they have their financial system is loaded with more money than the American system, which is still, in GDP terms, a much wealthier nation. Really unprecedented credit expansion. This is better, simple graph. This is M2 money supply. Simple measure of how much money you have in your system. The red line is China, the blue line is the United States. And remember, America is still, in GDP terms, considerably larger than China. China has printed a hell of a lot of money over the past 20 years, an enormous sum of money. Even as their growth level has actually been declining, this is the basic It's slowing. These are the growth accounting assumptions of the Chinese GDP. We're right now at this point. But overall, even China's own estimates that GDP is growing, but their financial system continues to expand. The present model, however, that they've built it on, public investment, slowly declining. The red line is what they do as a share of GDP. They're getting less productivity. Their ICOR, incremental capital output ratio figures, not proving to be quite as effective in terms of generating growth as we had were in the past. Corporate debt in China. That's American corporate debt. That's a Chinese corporate debt. Again, piling up enormous sums of debt. This is the basis of the BRI in the past, not, however, sustainable. This is the BRI lending policies. This is the red line is the policy banks. These are the government banks. The blue line is the Chinese commercial banks, the private banks. You can see a very sharp drop in Chinese private sector interest in giving money to BRI. Because the original sources of revenue that they were getting, which was basically just throwing money around, the government sanctions, slowly drying up. So that old model, as I said, of the first 5 years of BRI, not quite as strong as it used to be, which is one of the reasons they're trying to make it slightly different. And I mentioned earlier that FDI is still the best measure, I would argue, of whether or not Chinese are making investments on the basis of genuine commercial analysis, as opposed to just giving out loans or taking on bogus or geopolitically useful. And you can see that share of BRI overseas direct investment slowly declining, but definitely not growing anywhere close to the speed at which overall overseas FDI is rising. So what is happening in the BRI? I'd roughly argue what you're seeing now is the BRI starting to splinter into several different models. One is a geopolitical segment, in which for Pakistan, CPEC is probably the most important example. This, the Chinese will continue to pump money in, irrespective of how much they lose, because they are geopolitically important, or Xi Jinping has put a lot of personal credibility into them. Unfortunately for India, a lot of these are basically centered around our geopolitical concerns, both the Indian Ocean and the CPEC area. But commercial BRI or BRI projects which are doing fine, they are actually making money. They don't have a problem. Southeast Asia, Central Asia, but really Southeast Asia, that's the bulk of those projects. A lot of those are now effectively being privatized in the sense that the Chinese policy banks are selling out to private Chinese companies, or the Chinese partners are buying them out. There's a bunch of joint venture projects in the sense that they're trying to sell these to foreign investors. They're saying, why don't you become my minority partner or even majority partner? A lot of those are in Africa because they're simply losing huge amounts of money on them. A simple example recently was the Djibouti-Addis Ababa rail corridor, which so far Chinese investment companies have lost over $1.5 billion. So the insurance companies have lost. The original promoter hasn't even released how much money he's lost, but the insurance company, the Chinese insurance company, has already lost $1.5 billion. They're desperately trying to find somebody to put some money into it. Some of those projects are also in Latin America. And then I suspect we'll see over time, as I said, go back to those original slides, that the original huge cash flow that was driving a lot of these projects, and the original interest of the Chinese government that this is going to be this giant project, both of them slowly declining, you're going to have a lot of projects which are just going to be abandoned. And I suspect quite a few in Africa over time may be that. And finally, we'll go into a little bit of the smart BRI. As I mentioned, they're switching away from the construction to a lot of these other areas, the cyber, the space, the smart stuff. That's going to be where they're going to go, and those are going to be everywhere because they'll often be integrated into almost every BRI project anywhere in the world. So, in fact, I just saw Xinhua, when I say it's going to be smarter and more directed. Xinhua, just a few days ago, actually put out this line saying naysayers are not used to judging the Chinese economy by speed, but that is too old-fashioned. Smart observers look at the Chinese economy through indicators of quality. I would say that's now more or less also true for the BRI, insofar as BRI is so deeply intertwined anyway with large portions of the Chinese economy. The volume of Chinese outbound deals dropping It fell 13% from last year. And there's a lot more focus, as I mentioned, on digital standards, but also selling Chinese developments at home, surveillance systems. What we did in Xinjiang is something you can do in your country. The social credit system, this business that they have of this, trying to measure how everybody in their country has to fulfill certain forms of behavior set by the state. These are now being sold overseas as well, or being marketed overseas. And then they're reworking their own financial system, but I'll go into that a bit because I don't think that's actually going to be true in the end. Now, I'm going to quickly now go through something that I mentioned earlier. The Kiel Institute produced this excellent paper just a few months ago about, they tried to then analyze how much money was China actually sending overseas? Because we always knew that they were sending more than they were publicly claiming. The best simple example we had was recently when the Yamin government fell in Maldives, and the first thing the Chinese ambassador told the new government was, well, actually you owe us $1.5 billion more than your books actually tell you. And this is the kind of thing that's actually quite common around the world, it seems. And the Kiel guys actually tried to then find out how to do this. I won't go too much into methodology, but what they basically did is they went into the Bank of International Settlements. The Chinese now have joined, or actually send a lot of their figures to the BIS. This is like the central bank of the central banks. They still hide a lot of the specifics on the figures, but the broad numbers they have to admit. And using those numbers and then going through literally thousands of databases, the Kiel study produced, I think, an excellent report. So one of the key things they found, Chinese government now holds more than $5 trillion worth of debt toward the rest of the world, making them the world's largest government creditor, overtaking the United States, though the US, if the private sector is incorporated, still be larger, 6% of world GDP. And that doesn't include things like central bank swap lines, which are another $500 billion. East Asia, Central Asia, by far the most indebted to China, particularly small countries, the Laos and the Kyrgyzias of the world. After that is Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and then finally West Asia and North Africa. This is a little on the methodology. I won't go into all of that, but keep in mind that each recipient receives a different kind of package. If you are an advanced country, you're likely to be getting portfolio investments, sovereign bond purchases, US Treasury bonds, for example, would be the obvious thing. If you're a developed country, a less developed country, you'll probably be getting direct loans from the Chinese policy banks. And the Kiel report is pretty clear. A lot of this lending doesn't make any sense unless it is underpinned by geopolitical objectives. So this is a quick map on Chinese overseas lending rates, overseas lending as a whole, and this is against percentage of world GDP. So this is, at this level, we're touching $600 billion worth. Portfolio debt investment is the biggest chunk, but this is where it goes back to what I'm saying, that's US Treasury bonds or Euro bonds and stuff like that. That's largely the safe stuff, though it still gives them a lot of influence with a lot of governments. But the direct loan component is in many ways the most sensitive, because it's one where they effectively go directly to a government, where they also do a lot of fudging, and where they often have direct influence on that government, and charge interest rates that are often commercially driven. This goes into the data that they went in through, so I'll skip that. I'm happy to talk about it. So look at this, debt to China as a percentage of GDP, and as a percentage of external debt. This is the total debt. Total debt is the black line. What they calculated on the Kiel report is the red line is the hidden debt. This is the secret debt that until now we've not known about. So you actually now have, this is the top 50 recipients of Chinese money. So you're looking at figures of about 15% of the total external debt owed to China was not in the books of either the Chinese, or was hidden from public view, and as much as 7 to 8% of the GDP, the equivalent of GDP of the recipients of Chinese money, was basically also hidden. The debt as a percentage of GDP figures. So this is the BIS figures that they went through. Now, what happened is Russia and China joined or began reporting at the same time to the BIS, but they don't give any breakdown figures. So what you actually have is Russia and China money combined. But since Russia has no money to give to anybody and has very little in the way of aid, the assumption is that almost all this money is Chinese money. And if you look, this is Pakistan. So you can see that this was the official figures for the amount of debt they were getting. Suddenly, if you incorporate the BIS figures, it jumps. It almost doubles. So that's basically then tells you this is in billions of current US dollars. So it's roughly somewhere in the lines of $8 to $9 billion extra debt that China had hidden from the rest of the world that Pakistan owes to them. These are other countries, South Africa, Laos, Zambia, again I mentioned these small strategic countries. So then this is another example of the degree of secret debt that is there as a percentage of external debt. What is interesting here is that a handful of countries have unusually large amounts. These are countries that China has obviously targeted. And in some countries, 10% of the recipients of Chinese money, the debt is as much as 25% of their external GDP. And in some cases, it's also as much as 15 to 18% of their GDP as a whole. We'll skip this. And this is a list of the countries and the final calculations that they have for the external debt to China. Again, a huge number in Africa, Central Asia. Unfortunately, a lot of them countries that we in India would be a little nervous about. But Djibouti, for example, is number one. Maldives is number three in this list in terms of the amount of money that they owe the Chinese as a share of their GDP. And in the case of Djibouti, you can see it's 100%, equal to 100% of their GDP. And this country has completely gone to China. There's a crisis. If you then calculate that debt into the actual amount of emerging or developing country debt, these countries should be heading for a major meltdown. It should be equivalent to the huge financial crises that happened in the past with developing country debt. Why isn't this happening with China? The answer seems to be that China is effectively, there's another chart to come to the end, is actually renegotiating the debts bit by bit. The question is, what is a quid pro quo in return for this is not clear, and the Kiel report unfortunately doesn't go into that. Very quickly, three types of Chinese loans seem to be pretty clear: interest-free, concessional loans from Exim Bank, commercial loans extended by a variety of their banks and so on. Exim Bank and China Development Bank represent 75% of what's happening. Type of debt, almost always official. It's always Chinese government debt involved. And bulk of it is in dollars. Despite all that talking about internationally, the renminbi, they demand the payments in dollars, which indicates that they still want to get as much dollars as they want. And finally, I just mentioned this is that the bulk of these loans are at commercial lending rates. In other words, instead of going to the World Bank and getting effectively money for free, these governments are taking money at horrendous, it's equivalent to what we get when we go to our own banks for a housing loan, which makes no sense unless there's a reason. There's no financial reason for this, but China basically demands secret clauses, huge interest rates, and dollars in return for the debts that they give. The very final thing I'll just say is you can see this is the number of debt restructuring by China, the red lines. So China, which traditionally hates to restructure or forgive debt, has increasingly been restructuring debt. And we assume, therefore, there's a reason why they're doing it. Restructuring and then keeping quiet about it is because there's a quid pro quo. Thank you.